My name's Anthony Bigelow. I'm from First Friends of Dandenong Creek. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, albeit virtually, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the fourth seminar in our series that we've been conducting with the Victorian Environment Friends Network. The general theme for the series so far has been rewilding suburbia, so covering different elements of that. Tonight's seminar is to be conducted by Steve Marshall. Unfortunately, Dave Charlie is unable to attend. I think Dave's caught up on other business at the moment, Steve?
Yeah, family business, I believe.
Fair enough. So, yeah, apologies. But Steve is very much the other half of the dynamic duo at Bio2 Labs. So we are more than blessed in his hands. So thank you, Steve. Greatly appreciated. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. Q&A will be later this evening at 7:45. Please raise questions through chat and we'll try and capture those and then relay them to Steve towards the end. The seminar will also be recorded as well too, so we are publishing this live to the First Friends of Dandenong Creek Facebook page. So if you do miss it or you do need to go back through any additional items, please refer back to that. Yeah, so look, Steve, I'm going to hand over to you to sort of do a quick overview of why we're talking about stormwater, which seems to be somewhat alarmist when we say it's a significant environmental dilemma. But I guess in a lot of ways, once you start looking into what it's doing and how it's affecting our creeks and waterways and animals, you can probably appreciate that it is a significant problem and it's not one that's going to be going away anytime soon. So at this particular point, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, I agree. It's you may feel that it is, say, less significant than something like climate change, but it is very much remains a massive issue for Australian cities and cities around the world. It encapsulates a lot of the same issues that we have with climate change and other environmental problems, and in many ways I prefer to see it as an opportunity rather than or a challenge rather than a problem. Hopefully that thinking is becoming more widespread in government and regulatory circles as well. So welcome everyone. Thanks for giving up an hour of your evenings. So I'll just say a few words by way of introduction. Thanks to Anthony for the introduction already. So I'm the other half of Bio2 Lab, as he mentioned, and cut my chops at Melbourne Uni for about the last 12 years or so at the Centre for Environmental Stress and Adaptation Research and the Centre for Aquatic Pollution Identification and Management. And my main areas there were of interest were aquatic ecology and ecotoxicology and identifying chemicals of concern impacting waterways. So I do probably more of the tech stuff at Bio2 Lab, and very lucky we've been able to apply some of that to stormwater, as you will see. So I'll talk about what is stormwater and why is it a problem. We'll look at what the impacts are on our local waterways, although I'm sure many of you will be very much aware of those, being part of such well-informed friends groups. I'll then go on to talk a little bit about water-sensitive urban design and some of its strengths and weaknesses in relation to solving these problems and mitigating these impacts. And then that leads on to stormwater pollution, which is less well addressed by water-sensitive urban design. So we'll talk about identifying stormwater pollution, assessing it, diagnosing its causes and sources, and how do we track down the really important sources, and what can we do about it as community groups. So how can we link that data to community education and awareness and help change people's behaviour to bring about better environmental outcomes. So you can't talk about stormwater without addressing impervious area. Now, for those of you who don't know, it is quite a key concept in stormwater. It refers to how porous a surface is on a catchment scale to water. So how easily can water penetrate that surface? You can see in the images to our left, that was taken in an industrial area down in the southeast. Now, you can see if you're a raindrop falling on that, you have very few green areas to fall on. Almost all of those areas are going to be either asphalt, zinc aluminum or galvanized roofing area, solar panels, nothing which is going to absorb water. So the water is going to run straight off into a drain and hit the nearest creek at high velocity. Now looking at the image to the bottom of that, is an example of much less impervious area. Most of that is either grass or stream itself. So when the water hits that, it tends to soak in. It doesn't immediately run off. So it has a chance to be slowed down and filtered through soil, filtered through vegetation before it hits the nearest stream. Now, the impact of that is that high impervious areas, when it rains, they produce very high peak volumes after rain events, and they do it very quickly. Whereas less impervious areas, that rain is filtered through the soil, the peaks are not as high, and the volumes are not as high after rain events. And that has critical impacts on the stream ecology and the physical form in urban areas. So in essence, what you have is you're changing the surface of the catchment as you roll out these suburbs, roll out these buildings and built up areas and paved areas. You're changing from the situation on the left, from a forested area to an urban area. And in summary, that is going to lead to massively increased runoff. All of that stormwater is either runs directly off into the creek or is conveyed there by pipes, which means you have massively reduced infiltration to groundwater. That in turn means you have a lot less base flows. So not only do you have higher peak flows, but you have much smaller base flows. So that means that your creeks are much more likely to dry out during summer, which is obviously pretty bad news if you happen to be an animal that lives there, but much more likely to flood after very small rain events. So that's the key to understanding what water sensitive urban design is to look at what it's trying to prevent. And so what we're really trying to prevent is those really high peak flows after rain and the absence of flows in dry weather. Now you can see that in the simplified hydrograph. Now, for those of you who haven't seen one, this just represents stream flow or water runoff from a drain after a rain event with time. So you can see the point here at which this dotted line kicks up is where our rain event begins. And this is just a way of saying, as the rain falls, the volume of water coming off the catchment rises very sharply. It reaches a higher peak, and the volume under that, the area under that peak represents the volume of water that runs off. So not only does it run off faster, it hits a higher peak, but also more water runs off. The converse of that is you have much less water stored in the catchment, and so your base flow gets lower and lower. And that in turn leads to your creeks then drying out, becoming completely ephemeral in summer. Now that leads to many, many impacts. Now this was really quite an in-depth summary of those impacts, but I don't want to jam all of this down everybody's screens. The important thing to look at here is that the impacts are on flow, but those flow impacts are then also have impacts on water quality, both directly and indirectly, and stream morphology. They also impact things like light, organic matter input. These all then have an impact on the ecology of the stream and completely change it. So it's just it's a way of demonstrating how fundamentally this process of changing the catchment changes the stream, completely changes it. So just to summarise, once we've reached a certain amount of paved area, we're going to have higher peak flows. These are going to lead to eroded stream banks and physically degraded streams. We're going to have lower dry weather flows, so we're going to have much less habitat for the animals that live in the stream, and we're going to increase our transport of pollution into our streams enormously. So we can see this already with our EPA beach warnings after rain, our EPA river warnings, don't swim in the Yarra after rain, kids, not a good idea. And obviously the animals are suffering it as well. To give you an idea of what this means in terms of physical form, this is from an American paper, so they refer to it as total impervious area, but it's more or less the same thing. So in a rural area, the stream is not too badly incised. You can see the cross section looks like this. As the impervious area increases to around about 40%, you can see it's become deeply incised and the water table has dropped dramatically. And we see this, this is a very familiar sight through our urban streams. This happens to be one near me, but I'm sure you're all familiar with this morphology. And what this tells you is that the stream catchment there's too much paved area, it's too impervious for the size of the stream. When those floodwaters hit after even relatively small rain events, it's enough to just completely cut out the stream banks. You can imagine what that means for platypus habitat, for example, or water rats. So if you make your burrows in those banks and they're being cut out like that, that's going to have a massive impact on where you can live. So water sensitive urban design was conceived as a way to try and mitigate these problems. So this is an example of a development in Croydon that we visited a few years ago, quite a new development, but you can see it looks really quite nice. Looks, you know, if you lived near this, you'd probably be quite happy for it. You know, you got some ducks there. The water quality looks really good, and that's supposed to perform many objectives. So it's supposed to be managing stormwater quality, mitigating the flood risk, because that wetland will also act as a retarding basin. So it captures floodwaters and lets them out slowly. They'll also be harvesting rainwater and stormwater for usually for non-potable use in Melbourne. It's also designed to green the urban environment. So this is to reduce the heat island effect. So reducing the amount of the peak temperatures that you get in summer by providing sources of transpiration, sources of water vapor to the local environment. And that's really important as climate change becomes increasingly severe. There is a part for water sensitive urban design to play in mitigating those effects as well. And of course, the one the developers really love is improving the aesthetics. It's well known that property values increase with proximity to water. Has to be clean water. If it's a polluted mess, not so much. But if the water just looks good, you don't have to be able to swim in it. The closer you are to that, the higher your property values generally. Doesn't matter if it's a river, a beach, or even a lake. Developers are well aware of this. So they're quite keen on the idea. It developed in the USA probably first in response to the Clean Water Act of 1972, and they refer to it as low impact development. In the UK, they were a bit more creative with their acronyms, and they came up with SUDS for Sustainable Urban Drainage Techniques. Quite like that one. In the EU, there was the Water Management Directive, which has driven a lot of these, but their situation is a little different because they have more combined sewer overflows, whereas in the US and in Australia particularly, we have very few cities that have combined sewer overflows. Generally, our stormwater system and our sewer systems are completely separate. The only city I know that is not that way is Launceston, I believe, has a little bit of combined sewer overflow, but everywhere else we keep our rainwater completely separate from our sewage. Now, in Australia, it's known as water sensitive urban design, but the key point here is that the legislation varies widely by states and by local governments. So there's national guidelines, but they're only guidelines, and it's up to the states really as to how they implement them. And really the states then devolve most of that to local government through the Planning Act. So it comes down to planning law enforced at a local government level. So in China, they've jumped on this concept, calling it sponge cities, which is quite descriptive, I think, quite a good name for it. But obviously they were much later to the party. So they've got a handful of cities that are serving as pilot cities for this. And of course, being China, they're doing it on a really big scale in those cities. And in Africa, they're known as water sensitive settlements. And all of them have a guiding philosophy of total catchment management. So they're all moving towards this concept of keeping any rain as close as possible to where it falls. So it's a real reversal of the old Board of Works approach, where creeks and rivers were seen as drains, and in fact were often called drains, and their primary purpose was to get water away from property as quickly as possible. Every other consideration was secondary to that. So water sensitive urban design tries to achieve these goals using three main types of approach, and they can be broadly divided into point, linear and area treatments. So our point treatments can be things like just bioretention cells, even rainwater tanks can be very effective on a catchment scale, constructed wetlands, dry ponds, basins, rain barrels, sand filters, all of these things. You can see one down at the left, which is just a very local point infiltration basin. Many of you may be familiar with these in your local suburbs. Some people love them, see them as evidence of good water management. Some people hate them because they accumulate litter. It all comes down to how they're managed. So the linear ones, you will again see a lot of these around increasingly in new subdivisions, so grassed swales and infiltration trenches. So you're replacing what would have been a concrete gutter with a grassy, porous system where the water slowly infiltrates through the gravel and the porous media, and there'll be a porous pipe at the bottom of that, and the water will move much more slowly through that system. And area systems, a little less developed, but things like porous pavements, that they are out there and they do work. It's unclear as to how well they'll continue to work over many years and what needs to be done to maintain them and to stop them clogging, and what happens to pollutants. But they are still a very promising technology. As you can imagine, for large car parks and things, they may be the only applicable technology that is going to have any traction or any possibility. So just as a reminder that what we're trying to do with all of these technologies is to make the post-development hydrograph resemble the pre-development hydrograph. So we're trying to dampen that peak of the hydrograph We're trying to slow down the passage of water through the catchment and trying to get it to soak into our ground, to use the ground, use the catchment like a sponge, keep it there as long as possible to feed that base flow. So in Victoria, this was very strongly influenced by the Port Phillip Bay Environment Study in 1996, which again, many of you may be aware, massive study by CSIRO and many, many collaborators. And the gist of this rather large report is that, was that most of the pollution that comes down the Yarra and the Werribee rivers and into the Port Phillip Bay, most of the toxicants, things like heavy metals and oils, tend to be immobilized in sediments, and they tend to stay there. So they don't tend to get turned over a huge amount. Whereas nitrogen and phosphorus, but particularly nitrogen, turns over quite rapidly due to marine and benthic phytoplankton. However, the study did show that there was a limit to how much nitrogen the bay could metabolize, and that if this was exceeded, the consequences could be really bad. So it suggested that the bay could flip from a phytoplankton, a benthic phytoplankton dominated system to a very turbid phytoplankton dominated system, basically become very eutrophied and murky and horrible, and not what we want. So as a consequence, there's been a special focus on reducing nitrogen inputs to the bay ever since. So Melbourne Water's really been quite focused on that, and that has then fed into stormwater policy at a state and local level. So the Victorian guidelines for stormwater management require you, if you're building a new development, they require you to take some sort of action to put in some sort of stormwater management and water sensitive urban design to achieve an 80% reduction in suspended solids, that's TSS, total suspended solids, 45% reduction in total phosphorus, 45% reduction in nitrogen, total nitrogen that is, TN, a 70% reduction in gross pollutants. So that's achieved by those technologies that I referred to previously, those vegetated swales, the rain gardens, the little bioretention pits, all the way up to wetlands and things like that. Now, Melbourne Water also operates a stormwater offset service. To give you an idea about how much this is worth, nitrogen is priced at $6,645 per kilo per year. So if you can't achieve or decide that it's not cost effective for you to achieve as part of your development those reductions, that 45% reduction, so you can't get all the way there because you're constrained by space or cost or some other reason, you can pay Melbourne Water that price, that amount of money, and they will offset that. They'll use that to offset those nitrogen inputs somewhere else in the catchment. So you can see that's quite a significant amount of funding. If you're talking about a large development, that could get very expensive very quickly. Now, unfortunately, water sensitive urban design tends to overlook other pollutants. So although it's really focused on suspended solids, nitrogen, phosphorus, it does tend to have a less focus on heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and pesticides, those sorts of things. Now, although they may not be so important for the bay, they have a dramatic detrimental impact on local waterways. So as stormwater runs across those hard surfaces, it's very effective at picking up that pollution. You can see here, due to this rather shoddy storage, we've got these big I see bees of, oh, God knows what, stored on the nature strip, and they are just leaking straight into the gutter. Where is that going to go? Straight into the drain, into the nearest creek, and then onto the bay. And you can broadly divide those stormwater pollution up into these categories. So sediment and turbidity, which is fairly visible, nutrients, which you may not be able to see, but which is dealt with fairly well by water sensitive urban design. And then you've got all of the other things, oxygen depleting substances, things like detergents, hydrocarbons, oil, grease, microbial contaminants from septic tanks or medical discharges, heavy metals, synthetic organics like pesticides, and other persistent organics like PCBs or PFAS, PFOS. Now that image is, we're not quite sure, but we think it was some kind of food discharge, like a coloured oil, but we weren't able to definitively find the source in that case. But you can see it's not great. So as that land use, different land use becomes dominant in the catchment, you get very different types of pollution generated. And you have to match the stormwater strategy to the pollution profile. So there's no point targeting your pollution strategy at, say, nutrients. If you have an industrial catchment, they may be producing some nutrients, but they're largely going to be producing heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and other synthetics. So you have to tailor the approach to what is in the catchment, what the land use is. Our work has shown that industrial pollution is a major problem in Melbourne. There's a number of reasons for this. A lot of the time it's lack of awareness. So we have some areas which have a very high proportion of small to medium businesses, which may not have the resources or the time to really educate themselves about these sorts of issues. They're just too focused on keeping the business afloat. There's just bad business practices where businesses can sometimes be wasting a product which could actually be a resource to another business. And Darebin, I think Darebin City Council's done some really great work with trying to link those businesses up. So one business's waste becomes another business's input, and actually everybody profits from it, and the environment doesn't get as trashed. So that's a really good initiative. Often these smaller businesses lack trade waste arrangements because they've grown into a particular line of work. They haven't really got the trade waste agreements in place yet, and they can be expensive, so they're not necessarily keen to do so. And there is also some businesses that just deliberately dump stuff because they don't want to pay to deal with it properly. So just for example, this discharge is currently under investigation, but we know where it's coming from, and we suspect it's just poor business practices. They're washing down equipment that has very high levels of contamination, but they're not doing it in a bunded area. So where they're just washing it onto the hard stand, it's going straight into the drain, straight into the nearest creek. This one down the bottom here, you can see was actually the runoff from a cheese factory. A PLC controller failed, so that a tank filling up wasn't detected that it was full, so a valve didn't close off. The tank just overflowed, and because they weren't on the ball, it kept overflowing for, I think, about 48 hours. And that overflow just went again straight into the creek, completely turned the creek green. So some of the work that Dave and I did a couple of years ago on land use showed that you could predict what pollution you were going to get in local waterways simply by looking at the land use. And you could use the zoned land use as a very good guide to what sort of problems you would get in stormwater in those catchments. And this was actually in wetlands that were designed largely as water sensitive urban design features. So they are doing their job, but what we were showing is that they're possibly not the best choice for some of these catchments, because some of them become very contaminated with heavy metals and hydrocarbons very quickly. And we were able to show that once industrial area, in this case, exceeds about 10% of a catchment by area, the pollution level of these persistent contaminants really increases sharply. And we were in a separate paper, we were able to show a quite different trend for the organic contaminants. In this case, it was insecticides. And it turned out that we didn't find insecticides in industrial areas. They were in residential areas, and we could link them to the demographics of the residential areas. So the lower the population density, and particularly the lower the dwelling density, so the more widely spaced the blocks, the more insecticides we found in the creeks. And the impact was quite strong and quite marked. And it was really driven by a particular synthetic pyrethroid insecticide called bifenthrin. And that's still an ongoing area of research for a couple of groups in Melbourne. So we can then apply techniques like this to profile stormwater pollution and look at what the contaminants are in the stormwater. And then we can use that to then identify the high risk areas, high risk drains, and locate really small areas of catchment that are responsible for this pollution. Education and enforcement programs are then used to target this area, or if the worst comes to the worst, then the EPA becomes involved. So it's quite difficult to sample in some of these drains, or stormwater in general, but particularly underground drains, because the contaminant concentrations are highly variable. So you tend to get very sharp pulse pollution events, and it's very expensive to collect grab samples that you need to characterise water quality, because to collect enough grab samples is really far too expensive for most programs. So that means often these pulses are missed. The pollutants are often not in water because they're attached to the sediment particles, and that means you've got to sample both water and sediment if you want to find them, and auto sampling can be quite expensive. So it's not really within reach of local councils, who have to do a lot of this monitoring and enforcement. So we've developed this Storm Scout samplers, which allow episodic events to be captured. They're fundamentally a passive sampler, and we can put them in these underground drains and determine what contaminants are coming down very quickly and cheaply. And this works by collecting the contaminants a little bit like a sponge. So when a high load of contaminants comes down, or a big pulse of pollution comes down, they accumulate in the sampler and they don't come out very quickly. They tend to just build up in the sampler. So every time we get a pulse, we'll get a nice increase in the concentration in our sampler. We can then analyse that after a week or so, and it'll tell us whether or not we have a problem at that site. So we've used this technology a number of places around Melbourne and elsewhere, but one that we were funded to do recently was down in the Werribee River catchment for the Werribee River Association, and that was looking at pollution levels throughout the catchment of the Werribee River and linking those pollution levels to what was happening in the sediment in the river. So we looked at a transect right along the Werribee River, all the way from where it starts up in the Wombat State Forest right down to the estuary. And we found several hotspots in the sediment that were quite high, which you can see down here where some of the urban areas had quite high levels of heavy metals and hydrocarbons. And an area in the Maltby bypass, around the Maltby bypass, had very high levels of those pollutants. So we profiled that area in some detail. So we went down to quite, single blocks, individual drain level, to see where it was coming from, and we were able to show that they were coming from quite small areas. So it wasn't the whole catchment that was producing these contaminants. It was really just a few points within the catchment. Now, that then led to a hotspot investigation with EPA, Victoria and the Werribee River Association working together. And we were able to utilise the OPAL program, the EPA officers embedded in local government, and they were just great. They were fantastic. So that's been a really good program from our point of view. It's just so good to get that engagement and with local government. And interestingly, they found the response from the business owners was very positive. So they didn't go in there with a big stick. They were really quite communicative, quite educational. They went in there to explain what was going on, explain that the monitoring had shown that there was a problem and that the problem was localized to their area. And the business owners were generally very receptive to changing their business practices, changing the way they worked, and generally they were not expensive things that they had to do. They could be as simple as just not cutting up a particular material out on the hard stand. All they had to do was cut it under cover instead of outside, and then sweep up the dust. And it could be that simple. So that was a really good example of a positive community and environmental outcome that was driven by this program, because we went back after 6 months and found that the pollution levels had decreased dramatically. So this was the same catchment in the Maltby bypass, and you can see that the pollution levels have gone from very high or extreme to basically low to moderate in just 6 months, which is amazing. And that's generally not requiring huge amounts of money to be spent on retrofitting or putting in rain gardens or wetlands or treatment trains. It's just behavioural change. So it's a very encouraging outcome, and it's something that I think all friends groups particularly can take heart from, because it means that the solutions are often not as complex or as expensive as we might think they are. So you can see here the difference in a pollution fingerprint at one of our bad sites. The top one was before and the bottom fingerprint was after. So that's each of those lines represents a different type of stormwater pollutant. And the further to the right those dots are, the higher the concentrations were. And obviously dark red is very bad, generally green is good, very low. And I'll see if we can actually show, there's an interactive actually available for this report. And I'll just see if I dare. This is actually publicly available now, I believe. So the link will be in the presentation if you would like to have a look at it at your leisure. I will ask you maybe not to all jump on at once, or we'll probably crash it. But you can see here that we have the, it's all interactive, so you can zoom in and out. But this was the stormwater pollution profiles. So these are the Storm Scout passive samplers in the drains in those parts of the catchment. And these are the profiles overall. So the stormwater profile for all the contaminants put together. If you want to know what each individual contaminant was, you can drill down to that level and find out every contaminant, what they were in each year of the program. So it's quite a good educational tool, and it's something that this sort of data really helps businesses to appreciate what their impact on the local environment is, and how they can improve that. So you can see the difference between the before and the after program in the stormwater. What a massive difference it makes. So we're very happy with that. So we did find pollution increase at one site, but I will say it was ridiculously easy to find this site because it had a huge white trail of sort of fine sediment running all the way from the premises into the drain, and all we had to do was follow it up the drain, find where it came out and onto the gutter, and then just walk up the gutter and find where it was coming from. So it was quite trivial to find the source. And I believe a pollution abatement notice was issued to that business, and they've since cleaned up their act. So not everybody gets it, but most people do. So this leads me to the community engagement aspect of our work. And this is one of the parts that I really enjoy, because it gives us a chance to get our work out into the community and really promote the environment to the community. And I'm sure it's what motivates a lot of you as well in the different friends groups. And generally, the biological monitoring is the way that the most popular way that we've done this, because the water bug programs, Melbourne water runs, the river detectives, they're all really well established. People just love these things. They're really good indicators of waterway health. They have direct relevance to ecosystem keystone species or very charismatic species like yabbies, like platypus, like fish. Everybody understands why they're important, or if they don't, they very quickly grasp it once we explain it to them. And they're obviously very useful because they have a range of different sensitivities to pollution, and indeed some of them are sensitive to specific types of pollution. So they're very good diagnostic indicators. So there's your very sensitive critters like your stoneflies, your mayflies, your caddisflies, generally speaking. Some are not quite as sensitive, but broadly speaking. And then your tolerant species like your snails, your worms, your midges, your water boatmen, they tend to be more tolerant. Again, there are exceptions, but generally they're your more tolerant taxa. So when we conduct biological monitoring to assess waterway condition, we collect the macroinvertebrates using a standard technique. And again, you probably, many of you know this through your engagement in the friends groups and through Waterwatch, but for those who don't, there's a standard technique where we sample for a set time, we collect and identify macroinvertebrates, and then based on their score, the site gets a signal score and a number of families, and those two scores are like a bit like a sort of a blood pressure and a pulse. They're like a good general indicator of stream health in that area. And that work was also done for this Werribee River survey, and again supported what we found with the chemistry. So our good sites, our healthy sites, tended to not have very much pollution, and generally our highly polluted sites tended to be in not such good health. Now, we can go a little bit further down this road to identifying chemicals of concern or contaminants of concern using a range of techniques. Sediment ecotoxicology is one way we can do that, and we can actually take these into the field and run them as in situ microcosms. And this was a lot of the work that we did at Catchment and at Caesar before then. And they involve exposing these macroinvertebrates to specifically to sediment collected from streams, and then assessing the impact on those invertebrates. So that can be done at an individual level or even a community level, as you can see here with these microcosms floating in this wetland. So we can actually look at community impacts, which is a very sensitive way to determine whether or not a sediment is toxic. So the reason this is important is because these pollutants can have impacts not just on individual animals, but right through the ecosystem. So they, as well as just impacting, say, an individual animal by causing reproductive changes or things like that, they can, or tissue damage, they can also lead to impacts with impaired reproduction, changes in sex ratios, changes in breeding behaviour, all the way up to complete loss of certain species, population changes, or replacement of one species with another. And there's been work showing that platypus and fish populations can be both directly and indirectly impacted by pollutants. So there's been work in Melbourne showing that where you have even low levels of pollution from stormwater, it impacts on the macroinvertebrate population, and that in turn impacts on the platypus population because they just don't have enough food or the right food to eat at specific times of year. So this just gives you an idea of the how the community can then get involved in a lot of these biological assessments. And as part of the Wurundjeri River program, we worked with the community doing training volunteers up to run the macroinvertebrate surveys. And so they picked up really useful skills in insect identification, biological assessment, and just basic techniques for performing invertebrate surveys. So this will be useful for many of them who are actually students in various environmental science disciplines, but also just people in the community who are interested in this. So we just had so much enthusiasm, so much positive response from the volunteers. It was really encouraging to see people just so interested in their local environment. And we found the same thing at the school outreach programs that we run as part of this. So we went to a number of the schools in the Werribee catchment area to conduct education programs and run a smaller or a more truncated version of the assessments. And we generally found that the kids were just so interested. They really were so excited to see all of the life in their local wetland or their local creek. It really opened their eyes, and we got such a positive response. It was a real highlight of the program for me. And I hope it was a highlight for them too. So the other aspect of water sensitive urban design that we see quite visibly in the street, and I referred to it earlier with my comment on rain gardens, is the impact on litter. So one of the things we did trial as part of this program was using drones to identify litter hotspots, and we combined those with on-ground litter surveys and community collection days. So we had the community actually collecting litter, identifying it, and then we were training the drone to identify hotspots of litter and see if we could get it to identify the impact of rain events on where this litter was accumulating. Again, community loved it. They were very enthusiastic. As part of this, there was some educational material produced as part of this program, and that's been able to be used across other programs and reused as well. And these were distributed to businesses in the area. They've since been reused in Nillumbik Shire for a program that we did there, where they were very well received, and we hope to be able to use them again in Bayswater as well. So you can see it's generally pretty basic stuff, using things like these neat little bunded pellets. So when you get your drums delivered on a pallet, they come in this special bunded pellet. So if there's a leak, it actually is collected by the pallet instead of just dripping through onto the hard stand. Using waste trays, using EPA approved contractors so that your solvent waste from your spray drums doesn't end up at a Bradbury's and just get stored indefinitely in a warehouse somewhere in northern Melbourne until it catches fire. Washing vehicles away from stormwater, using things like these, even portable bunding for spills, easily available and really effective. So there's very little excuse for poor business practices in this day and age. And we've just found that this education and awareness is just essential. And this is an example again of some of the material that we've been able to produce and utilise to get that message out there. So I'll also introduce you to a program that we've been involved with the First Friends of Dandenong Creek, looking at going beyond biological and getting the community involved in water quality monitoring. I think the plan again is to make this public. I think it's still restricted access, but eventually the plan is to make it public. And it still is an interactive water quality monitoring program along Dandenong Creek. So 4 monitoring points have been installed along the creek. So they're solar powered, connected to the phone network, and they monitor water quality continuously and stream it up to a live dashboard. And this was all made possible through the First Friends getting some grant funding from a federal grant, I believe, and applying that to this program. So it's been a great success. Now I can hopefully I can again show you the interactive version, but just to give you an idea of what the dashboard looks like. This is one of the monitoring stations looking at things like temperature, water conductivity. So how much salt is there in the water? How acid or alkaline is the water? And what's the oxidation reduction potential? So how oxidizing or how reducing is the water? And what we've been finding, very interestingly, is this was last Friday evening. We found there was a really big drop in oxidation reduction potential. And you can see that it actually came just before the drop in conductivity. Now, we're used to seeing these drops in conductivity because that's what happens when it rains. So when it rains, usually you get all this fresh water running off into the creek, and the conductivity will drop quite sharply and then gradually increase again as all that rainfall runs off and the creek gets back to its base discharge. But this is very unusual, and this also coincided with reports of a lot of foam being seen in the creek. So we're really excited about that because we think it's showing that we're picking these events up with our monitoring instruments before they actually are being reported. And at the same time as we can get that data to the EPA, that's very useful. So I can take you through, I can actually have a look at it. I think we've got time. I'm sure Anthony will tell me if we're out of time. But
all fine, Steve.
We're all right, are we?
Yep.
Very good. So yeah, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. So you can see here's your monitoring stations, and what we found was really interesting. Here was your Bayswater monitoring point, and what we found was that there's that big spike that I discussed. Now, what's interesting is that location is just here. So that's on Dandenong Creek, directly below where Old Joe's Creek comes in here. Now, just here is Bayswater North. So this is Dandenong Creek above where that sensor comes, above where that arm comes in. And if we have a look at that sensor, we can see there's the rain, same time, but there's no sign of that dip in ORP. There's a little dip there from the rain, but nothing like the massive spike. So that tells me that whatever's causing that in the Dandenong Creek is coming from that arm, because we can see we've ruled it out from this location, so we know it's coming from this area. So it's very promising. So I'm looking forward to following that one up and see if we can find out where it's coming from. All right, so I think that brings us to a close. Thank you, Anthony. I think we've got some time for some questions.
We do. Thank you, Steve. That's look, it's a fascinating subject, and I think from First Friends' perspective, the more you start looking at our waterways as locations for harbouring life, the quicker you realise that, you know, the way that we've geared our stormwater systems, you have to ultimately change that. You know, we can't keep going on like this and keep on treating our waterways like this. And that's, I think, you know, credit to yourselves, the technology that you've been able to implement in our section of the creek. That's at least, you know, highlighting what's happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's part of that whole community education piece. You know, I think for a long time, it's been, if it goes down that hole in the street and it disappears, people just forget about it. I think they think half the time it goes to the sewer system.
Oh, we know they do. We have done education programs, and that's not uncommon. People will just shake their heads and say, "Doesn't it go to Werribee?"
Yeah,
they just don't think about it, and if they do, they think, "Oh, it gets treated." Absolutely.
So, and you know what you've said. I mean, it starts at the home. It starts at the street level. It starts at the, you know, if there's spaces to put wetlands in, that's great. But there's so many different types of solutions that we can implement. And look, would it be fair to say they're not overly expensive? I mean, yes, there is a cost to it, but you know, it's absolutely not a dramatic cost.
Yeah, and I think I hope that's what I've tried to get across, is that there tends to be the knee-jerk response is an institutional response to say, okay, we need to spend a lot of money on putting in a wetland or putting in a rain garden or something like that. And what we've found is that's not the case. You can make huge differences in environmental outcomes just with a little bit of community education, and that's something that's well within the reach of community groups, and I find that very encouraging.
Absolutely. And I think what you described initially too about slowing down the water, I mean, that's half the battle. I mean, our creeks fluctuate so dramatically when you have not a significant amount of rain either, but you know, the Dandenong Creek will rise 2 meters and that will then drop within an hour. I mean, that's a significant waste of water. That water should be able to soak into the ground to, you know, let the plants have an opportunity to actually take it up. But you know, every time we see that, we think, well, you know, what are we losing here by doing that as well? And you see the vast amounts of rubbish that get carried out, you know, down the creek and then out ultimately to the bay as well.
Yeah. And look, I didn't emphasise that because it's not my area of expertise, but there has been a lot of work showing that the volume of water that we flush out through our rivers and creeks as stormwater, so excess stormwater, is greater than our projected water deficit in water supply over the next 20 years. And we're wasting it. We're literally just flushing it out to sea.
Absolutely.
There's
a couple of questions that have come through chat. There's one from Marty who's saying the local council here told me they insist on stormwater engineering for developments to ensure discharge into the local waterways is no greater than pre-development levels. Do you believe this?
Well, that's where I was referring to the 45% reduction in nitrogen, 45% reduction in phosphorus. That's what they're referring to. It's saying, okay, these should be no more than 45. They should reduce what's coming in by 45% compared to what it would have been. That is a worthy aim, but what we've found is that because there's such a focus on suspended solids, nitrogen and phosphorus, a lot of the other stuff tends to get overlooked because you can't see it. Now, you're well aware of it because of where your group's located, Anthony. I guess don't name any names, but I would not be surprised if this council is got a lot more greenfields development. Is that the case?
Not sure at this point, but look, it's possible. Yep.
Yeah, because you have this quite different strategy being successful in greenfields versus brownfields. So new development, so new land that's being development comes under those guidelines. Until very recently, if you were redeveloping existing land or rezoning existing land, the triggers were either absent or much reduced.
Okay. Another question from Nikki: how do we get involved in community training in biological assessment to run macroinvertebrate surveys? Waterwatch
is your go-to. Melbourne Water is fantastic. They've got an excellent program there, and depending where you are, I can probably put you in touch with someone. Actually, Teresa's, I think she's actually running that at the moment. So happy to forward some contact details.
If they have to do it, let's say that there's someone in country Victoria, could they also reach out to Melbourne Water to get some advice on that? Would that be a good starting point?
No, there are. I have to get back to you on that, but I'm pretty Melbourne focused in this area. I'm pretty sure there are opportunities to do it in regional areas, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head who the best would be. I'd probably go to the Waterwatch website as a first point of call, but my contact details are on the presentation, so I'm happy to follow that up.
Cool. I mean, I guess the other alternative is maybe reach out to the Catchment Management Authority. They might have someone that they could recommend.
Yes, you're right. CMAs would be an obvious first point of call.
Yep. Excellent. Very good. Just looking for a couple of other questions. Sorry, I'm just going quickly through the chat as well, just to see if there's any other questions from anyone else. Nothing's jumping out at the moment, more just comments. So just from Nicole, she's mentioned that Waterwatch is coordinated through the CMAs in regional areas. The River Detectives program is a great way for schools and youth groups to adopt their local waterway and learn about waterway catchment health through monthly water testing, habitat surveys and macroinvertebrate sampling. It's currently offered in 5 CMA regions, including Melbourne Water, across the state. So thanks, Nicole, for that. She's mentioned to check it out at riverdetectives.net.au as well.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, they were the ones who were also involved with the work in the Werribee catchment, and so they've got a very standard sort of way of doing things, and I recommend them very highly.
Yep. Catherine's just raised her hand. Catherine, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, fine.
Okay. I'm a new resident, and I see that I live right near that spike you were just talking about in Bayswater North, and I've been actively engaged in the few months I've been here in trying to get attention of Maroondah City Council to the stormwater problem with this part of the street. I live at the end of Central Avenue where it runs into the little park, lovely nature park at the end there, and there's a very, very bizarre stormwater drain there that is an environmental disaster. I don't know whether it's a pollutant, I'm sure it probably is, but can anyone advise me on how do I get to Maroondah Council, or what's the strategy I should use to try and engage actively with them, or through the community groups?
I can put you in touch with, we've had some dealings with some people there I can put you in touch with directly.
Yep.
If you like, I can pass on their details via email. I'm sure they'd be quite happy to hear from you. It's a bit tricky in that area because you've got Maroondah, you've got Knox, you know, the creek is the boundary, so it depends which side of the creek you're on.
Yes, yeah. But my particular concern is that the lack of attention by council to this end of that street where it goes into that park is causing a stormwater flooding issue, because they have gravelled some of the nature strips, made it very hard. You know, it's exactly as you described. It has compacted where all the cars park. Residents just like to park there, and so council threw a whole lot of gravel down some years ago, and it has become rock hard. And I haven't been here long enough to know, but I'm pretty sure that's caused a stormwater problem that they're ignoring.
All right.
I can certainly help as well, Catherine. We have contacts at council too, so more than happy to help follow it up with you.
Okay. You've got my email, I presume, and my
Yes,
contact details? Yeah, that'd be great.
Yep,
yeah.
Not a problem at all. Can do.
Or
great, thanks, Anthony. You'd be in touch with the same people I would be anyway. So.
Well, hopefully it's a bit hard to get through if you're, you know, just an ordinary resident.
Yeah, more than happy to help. Now, I think it's great to, you know, raise those questions. Sorry, someone else has just raised their hand as well. I just didn't see who it was, so please go ahead.
That could have been me. I'm Ben. I live in Bacchus Marsh. We have a lot of legacy stormwater stuff here that all goes straight into the creek. So years ago, we had 1,000 litres of used engine oil dumped by someone that went into the creek and things like this. But more commonly, it's just, you know, your usual sediments, litter and so on. I'm just wondering.
Oh, I've lost you for a second.
Sorry, that was my mistake then. Sorry, Ben, I'll just have to unmute you again.
You cut him off, Anthony.
I didn't mean to. I know I was just doing some admin work here and I inadvertently cut him off. Sorry, Ben, that was completely my mistake.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just wondering where you have this legacy, you know, we have huge pipes that just go straight into the Werribee River. It would be really nice to see some way, and, you know, I get your point about educating businesses to not dump their used engine oil or wash their trucks or whatever, but that's only part of the problem. I wonder if there's any sort of longer term projects or prospects for fixing some of that to a more sensitive kind of way of dealing with the wastewater, the stormwater, sorry.
Well, it depends on the scale. There's I touched on it very briefly, but there's a strange sort of legacy of the Board of Works where catchments over about 60 hectares are considered to be major drains and hence fall under Melbourne Water's responsibility, whereas anything smaller tends to be considered a council responsibility, and therefore Melbourne Water doesn't really deal with it directly. You'd have to go to the council. So if you were looking at something like some sort of end of pipe treatment, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, I don't know, anything really, or putting in catchment settlement ponds further up the pipe or whatever would help.
Then it depends how big is it and who's responsibility it is, and you get into this funny sort of finger pointing exercise because no one really wants to shout out for it. So
I'm familiar with that. Thanks. Yes.
I guess I would have to know more about it. I think it would be good to get in touch with your friends of Parwin Creek. I think we're actually doing some work with them.
Okay, yeah. That's not quite the same catchment as in Bacchus Marsh, but yeah, I know who you mean, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that area, but
Okay.
I guess, yeah, with your local friends group would be a good place to start, and then start with council and sort of work your way up.
Yep. Thank you.
Be prepared for the long haul.
And probably time just for one more question from Deborah. Are gross pollutant traps just an indication of underlying historic issues that need addressing?
Okay, that's an interesting one. So by gross pollutant traps, do you mean like what we would also call like litter traps?
I think that's what Deborah means.
Yes, that's what, yeah. We have a number in Geelong, and they're draining off, the water's draining off shopping centres and things into wetlands. So the council's put some, I have to say this very slowly, gross pollutant traps in to catch all the garbage.
Okay, and how, in your view, are they doing their job, do you think?
They are certainly catching litter, but probably not any chemical pollutants.
No, and I will say they're not designed to. But
No, they're not. They're designed to just catch the big stuff.
Yeah, but having said that, it's still valuable. They're still valuable, and
yes, we certainly encourage them, but it does mean that there's no stormwater control if that's what we have to do.
Yes, and that's, I guess, my second point was that they're increasingly used as one part of the treatment train. So the newer ones that I've seen, they will have a gross pollutant trap, usually underground, so you don't even see it, and that's the first treatment stage. Then you'll have a settling pond. Then you'll have a series of settling ponds in the wetland with different vegetation, and then often a final larger pond before the water then goes out, and all of that will be on a bypass. So if you get really high flows, the water will bypass the settlement pond and just go, and even bypass the gross pollutant trap and just go straight out to the creek, so that it doesn't.
We don't have settling ponds. They're just.
That's right. And so you've only got one stage, and that's historically, yes, that was more the way they were done, and you'll see a really wide variation in the designs of different GPTs. Some of them have been some of them are really effective, some of them not so much. And yeah, there's been a lot of experimentation, I think, with different engineering companies, and before they've found some that sort of strike that balance between being effective at trapping litter, being easy to clean, easy to maintain, and not creating flood hazards upstream. So it's yeah, but I would agree with you. They should only be considered. They're not a solution in themselves. They're just part of the solution. And ideally, we wouldn't need them if people would just put their garbage in the bin. So,
well said.
And just one final question, sorry, Steve, from Nicole Seymour, who's Mayor for Knox Council. Nicole's asked the question, what are the 3 big improvements that Council could make? If you could have 3 big things, what would they be?
Just at a council level?
Yep.
I think the opals are great. I would say more funding for opals. I don't think that it's fair that should come from council's budgets, though. I think that should be state funded, because they're fundamentally a state responsibility. So I would like to see a lot more opals, consistent application of stormwater planning principles across the state. So I'm not sure if that has to go through the municipal association or if that has to be refined through the state planning policy. And I'd love to see really, again, I'm not sure if this is realistic for councils, but I'd love to see with the opals, I'd love to see the EPA involved in really enforcing the new state environment protection policy. Now that you look at the way that works with, in say the US, councils get fined if their catchments don't meet the standards, and it's up to the councils to then go and chase down the businesses that are causing them to get fined. I don't think many councils would welcome that here, but it would be great to see the councils actually taking that role.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. Alrighty, Steve, just one final request from Dave. Could you pop your details back up in terms of contact details back up on the screen in case anyone would like to get in contact with you, if that's all right?
Yes, and I believe this presentation, you'll make this available, Anthony?
It's already available as we speak. So we've been live streaming this to Facebook. So if anyone would like, excellent, thank you. And if anyone would like to catch it again, please go to our Facebook page, which is First Friends of Dandenong Creek. But look, thank you, Steve. Fantastic presentation.
Welcome. Thanks to everyone for giving up an hour of your time this evening. And
thank you.
Really appreciate it. Good on you. All right. Night, everyone.